Now, Donald Trump is hailing it as Liberation Day for America, but millions of consumers across the world fear that the president's plans to unleash sweeping tariffs April 2nd could inflict lots of pain with little gain on scores of countries, including America itself. Economists are warning of higher costs for consumers and businesses, while the EU is vowing a firm response. And on the eve of that announcement, the question looms, will this so-called liberation lead to economic upheaval instead? France24's Doug Herbert is going to try and answer some of those questions for us on the set. Now, Doug, first of all, let's just start with a simple one. So what's the rationale behind Trump's tariffs, and why is this April 2nd being called Liberation Day?
Yeah, well, look, once again, this is a depending on how you see things type of issue. There are those who would say Donald Trump's already been hard at work liberating Americans from things like the rule of law, liberating them from due process, liberating them from civil rights, liberating them from freedom of expression, freedom of the press. So now this is his latest salvo in his series of so-called liberations. In this case, it's a liberation from what Donald Trump describes as decades of bad relationships with trade partners around the world that have ended up hurting American interests. He wants to break the shackles of those relationships, basically. He wants to sever those ties, and he wants to essentially use tariffs, which he has always loved. Tariffs are his favorite negotiating tools. He sees them as a way of essentially forcing countries with a very, very blunt cudgel, forcing them to lower trade barriers, to free up the flow of American goods back and forth, and to gain better access to their markets. The way he sees it is he believes that the European Union, especially, here we are in Europe, he said recently, was basically formed to screw the United States. Those were his exact words. He wants to basically now, as he sees it, level the playing field. But as you said, these tariffs are creating ripples of fear across the world, and also in America itself, because Donald Trump's vision is that this is something that will bring manufacturing back home. It will make basically more of the supply chain come to the U.S. But a lot of people say that the global economy is so integrated that by imposing these barriers, you're not simply raising the cost of foreign goods. You're ultimately hitting American consumers very hard, ultimately raising the costs of U.S. goods, because U.S. automobiles and so on and so forth often are made using foreign parts. It's not 100% one and 100% the other. So it's tricky, to say the least, but most economists are warning of just what you said in that intro, that this could boomerang very badly back in America's face.
Now, the EU already is having a plan, if you like, to retaliate if need be. What could that plan be, and what might the broader consequences of all of this be for the rest of the world?
Yeah, let's start with what the broader plan could be. Look, the European Union is in a real bind here, right? Because you might say, well, just slap them right back, fire back. But the fear is that if the EU goes tit for tat with the United States on these types of tariffs, precisely because the EU economy is so closely intertwined with the American economy, so in many sectors dependent on it, whether we're talking about German automobiles, BMWs and Porsches and Mercedes, or French luxury sector and wines and champagnes and perfumes, the list goes on. All of this means that anything the European does to retaliate could essentially amount to a circular firing squad. You're firing the bullet at the United States as a retaliation, but it ricochets right back at you. It ends up hitting you and your own economy. What they're looking at precisely is they don't know yet, because Donald Trump hasn't been clear yet about exactly what these tariffs are going to look like. Will they be country by country? Will they be sector by sector? Will they be broad across the board, hitting every country in the world, or will it be maybe against 10 to 15 major trade partners? What the EU is considering is what they call robust, timely, calibrated responses against perhaps service industries, against big tech industries, against big banks, against even the licenses that U.S. businesses would need to do business in Europe. All of these things are under consideration, but we don't know yet what the tariffs are going to look like.
Doug, how do these tariffs usually go down? Do they strain alliances? Do they erode trust? I mean, how do they play out usually?
Yes and yes. So yes, Jeannie, they strain alliances, and the fact that the goal in Trump's mind being, as I said, to bring down trade barriers using a very blunt and forceful weapon to do so. But the trust erosion is there. Let's not forget that the U.S. and EU, sure, the trade relationship has been imbalanced in many sectors for many decades. That's true. But the way most economists would say, most people who work in banks, most people who work in companies, even a lot of consumers say, the best way is through negotiation. Yes, you erode trust, you erode ties. The fact that the EU right now is regarding the U.S. not just as a political and potentially military adversary, but now as an economic adversary, that is a type of trust that is very easy to break and very hard to build back. No matter what happens from here on out, it's going to be very hard for the EU to rely on the U.S. as a trading partner again. Trading wars look like they are now going to be the flavor of the day going forward. And I'll just end with the note that even Goldman Sachs is looking at the risk of a recession for the U.S. economy, probability of around 35% as a result of these types of trade tariffs.
All right, Doug, thank you for that. Doug Herbert there on the so-called Liberation Day for America that Donald Trump is promising for tomorrow. Thank you.